I'm Gavin McPherson and this is Oasis Property TV. Now today I'm going to talk about what I think is the central tenet of property investment. In fact, this is the reason I buy property. Capital growth. Now there are various characteristics investors decide to seek in real estate investment, and the most common are yield or a rental return, and the other is capital growth. Now before we start, one has to remember a few basic points that aren't able to be challenged. Now the first one is that yield, or rental return as we know it, is largely a function of the living amenity, or the actual constructed portion of the home. It is the accommodation that a tenant actually decides to pay rent for because it offers him or her, and usually their family, a certain utility value. Now capital growth, however, is largely a function of the land beneath that utility becoming scarcer and scarcer over time. So to help anyone out there who's deciding to invest in a high yielding property portfolio, sure, this might net you a few extra dollars today, but once you execute this play, it usually makes for a very busy portfolio with a lot of properties, which might make you feel like you are wealthy. But having met and advised many people over the years, and certainly trying this strategy myself, I have found that in the long term, positively geared portfolio owners eventually realise that as those new houses they once bought increase in their age, they see their utility value is diminishing. And they get a shock after a decade or so when their portfolio has well underperformed a portfolio geared towards capital growth. Now even worse than that is that these new houses don't stay new for long, and when high rent is being given because of a property's condition, you can be sure this will underperform its peer properties which have high rents because of their location. And if you follow this strategy for say 10 years, a decade's a long time to waste in building wealth. Now furthermore, as a little hint as to whether the area you're investing in is going to encourage capital growth, let's just try this trick. And click on to say Google Maps from a topographical view of the area you're thinking about buying into, and zoom out. And as you zoom out from your primary target or city, you do not want to see vacant usable land. If you can see vacant usable land, then your prospects of achieving above trend capital growth are very, very slim, and I'd almost say impossible. Instead, you want to see houses on every piece of dirt possible. Do you know what this means? This means that the area is in demand, and it's likely that it always has been. It also means the market has spoken. Now this is not me saying this, it's history telling us that this has always been the case. Take a look at Rome and how it was built. Now without wanting to move into the political incorrect territory, I might just have to for a second. It was simple. The gentry, the affluent, the influential people in society lived on the hill. They had the views, they had the best positions. It was their land and they didn't share it with anyone. They could afford to keep their plots larger, they were happy to pay higher fees to keep their land, and unfortunately the plebs, as they were called, they live out of this area in an outward fashion until land became very cheap. And that was largely because there was more of it. Does this sound like any area you know of, specifically Sydney and Melbourne? If you think Rome is an outlier example, it's not. Think Istanbul, think London, think Beijing, think Manhattan. Do not think Oklahoma, don't think Ballarat, and don't think Wagga Wagga. This is probably one of the best ways to explain from a conceptual point of view. So let's use a small example of a graph here on my right. And with a line running from bottom left to top right, let's call this line an index. Now of course it could represent any index. Maybe it's the ASX 200. Maybe it's a commodities price index. Although I'm sure that you realise that no index moves in a perfect exact linear fashion. So I've just smoothed out the highs and lows of the market to create this graph. Now our job, is it not, as investors, is to make every effort to outperform that index. So let's find out how to do it. Now I've done this for years with millions of my own money and millions of other people's money. But one thing to note is that I apply the same principles on every single property, and I do it as if I'm buying every property for myself. Okay, so let's get started with something that's meaningful to us and as local as possible, Australia. And we'll use by way of example the Australian population growth, which is 8.34% in the last census between 2006 and 2011. So minus a nominal minority, these people are and do get housed. They have to, but where are they getting housed? The market has always usually decided where these people want to be. And that is why capital cities become capital cities. Now let's get a little bit more local and find out where in capital cities where people will pay more for something, and hence improving that location's capital growth more than, say, for instance, another place. So let's use 4 local government areas, or LGAs, and you might know some of these by name or their reputation. Let's use, say, the Mosman LGA in Sydney. For those in Melbourne, this might be a little bit like Toorak. For Brisbaneites, more like Hamilton or Ascot. And we'll also use, say, the Waverley LGA. Now, Waverley doesn't really need a comparison because you'd recognise one of the most iconic names within it, the most obvious being Bondi. Now, in that same census where Australian population grew by 8.34%, Mosman grew by only 3.62%. It's important to think about this. Less is more. In a nutshell, the LGA of Mosman are not accommodating for as many people as it should. And that is Mosman not doing its bit for population growth. And in the same vein, Waverley grew again by only 3.82%. That's an area which is pretty much fully developed. And when the land becomes fully developed, you notice that what is really in demand is not the houses or amenities constructed upon them. It's the land. And when land becomes scarcer, the price must go up over time. In short, it's scarce and it's becoming scarcer. And it's also important to remember that there is not many suburbs or LGAs that meet my criteria. In fact, I've got a list of less than 80 nationwide. And with over 8,000 suburbs in Australia, that's less than 1%. And the fact that they're all in major capital cities is not a coincidence. Remember again, Rome, Istanbul, London, Manhattan. So let's get back to our index for a second. Now, by betting on areas like this above all others is the best way to guarantee above trend growth. So I like to make sure that I beat the index, and we do consistently over time. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. Now, as a Western Suburbs boy who went to school in Granville and Parramatta, I don't say any of this because it was a bad place to live in. It wasn't. But in considering property investment, the jury, honestly, has already made up its mind. These LGAs underperform the index. So in that same census period, the Parramatta LGA has increased its population by 12.5%. Its close neighbour, the Blacktown LGA, increased its population by 10.8% in the same period. So let's break this down. Anything that allows more people to take possession of it inevitably becomes less valuable than something that allows less people to take possession of it. It's called supply and demand. Now, luckily for me, this isn't a political video, so I'm not here to tell you that all this is necessarily fair, that this is how cities are planned. I'm also not making any conclusions about how enjoyable any of these places to live in. I'm just telling you that this is how cities have been planned for millennia. And the future was not going to be any different, I'm afraid. The affluent feather their nests and keep their areas restricted to development, and this can only do one thing for land values over time, and that is increase them. And I didn't make these rules, I just played the game knowing the rules, and I suggest that you do too. So now it's true that in a bull market like we're currently in now, it's easy for even the bad suburbs to go up in value, but this is affordability during this present time. It is not demographics, which occurs over a much longer time frame. And in this index, clearly even the worst performing suburbs still increase over time. In fact, property price growth has since 1901 outstripped inflation by between 1% and 2%. So it's a good bet in any event. But after say 10 years, you can see how much more progress is made by those blue chip suburbs I'm mentioning in the top of that graph. So for those who are investing for the long term, which is how you really get wealthy, this can often be the difference of 20 or 30% more. And after 20 or 30 years, the difference can be mind-boggling and will make the difference for many of you of a comfortable retirement or not. Of course, there are going to be plenty of spruikers and hotspotters who like to challenge these unchallengeable facts. They're going to be telling you where the next great infrastructure project will be or where a new mine is going to go, and that's not going to cut it. Instead, apply the tests in this little video, starting with the Google Map macro test and moving to your target suburb using my demographic micro test. And you'll find out that most of their arguments just fall away. And they're trying to sell you into a one-trick pony. Now, who cares if a new mine gets built? I want to buy in areas, and I'd like you to buy in them as well, where the land is already taken up, where people are repairing old bridges that were built and fixing potholes and arguing with each other how they're going to fit any new people in their suburbs at all. Now, these rules have been set thousands of years ago. You won't change them, so just play them. Now, for other tips, watch all of our Oasis Property TV videos, and also for those of you with a bit more time, you can pick up my book also from Dimmick's bookshops and all around Australia or online. Or similarly, if someone wants to take me out for a coffee any day of the week, I might even bring along your own complimentary copy. Now that's me for this week. Happy investing.